Have you ever met someone who seemed utterly convinced the world revolved around them and wondered what was actually going on underneath that certainty? Narcissism is usually described as arrogance, selfishness dressed up in psychological language. But what research has found across careful clinical work going back decades is that narcissistic behavior is not a defect that arrived from nowhere. It is a coping strategy, and that changes everything about how you understand it. Psychologist Heinz Kohut, one of the most influential theorists of the self, argued that narcissistic patterns develop when a child's emotional needs go unmet at a critical stage of development. What the child needs is what Kohut called mirroring, the experience of being seen, validated, and reflected back as worthy. When that mirroring is absent, inconsistent, or conditional entirely on performance, the developing sense of self becomes unstable. It cannot be grounded in felt experience, so it builds something else instead, a structure, a performance, a defended self that does not rely on genuine connection because genuine connection has proven unreliable. That structure is what we later recognize as narcissistic behavior. The grandiosity, the need for admiration, the difficulty tolerating criticism. These are not signs of someone who thinks too highly of themselves. They are signs of someone whose inner sense of worth is so fragile it must be constantly reinforced from the outside. And that fragility, Kohut argued, is not a given. It was produced. If the behavior is a defense, what exactly is it defending against? Research by psychologist Craig Malkin draws an important distinction between two narcissistic patterns. The overt form inflates the self, performing superiority to manage the fear that the true self is unacceptable. The covert form erases the self entirely, becoming whatever others need. Both, Malkin argues, emerge from the same wound. The mask can face inward or outward, but it is still a mask, and beneath both patterns is the same thing, a self that never felt safe enough to simply exist without justification. Neuroscience adds a layer that most accounts leave out. Brain imaging studies have found that people who score high on narcissistic traits show reduced activation in regions associated with empathy. Not because they lack the capacity, but because those neural pathways appear suppressed. Interestingly, when participants were explicitly instructed to try to empathize, the suppression partially lifted, which suggests that the absence of empathy in narcissistic behavior is not a fixed biological reality. It is, in some measurable sense, a learned habit of self-protection. The empathy is there. It has simply been walled off because allowing it in felt too dangerous. Shame researcher Brené Brown has written extensively about what she calls armored behavior, the ways people construct defenses against the unbearable feeling of being exposed as inadequate. Narcissism, viewed through this lens, is one of the most elaborate armors a person can build. Every act of self-promotion, every episode of entitlement, every moment of contempt directed outward, these are not expressions of inner confidence. They are attempts to outrun a shame so old and so deeply embedded that the person carrying it may have no conscious awareness it exists. This does not make the behavior acceptable. Someone can cause genuine harm and still be understood. Explanation is not the same as permission, but it shifts the question from what is wrong with this person to what happened to this person. And that is a more honest question to ask. Philosophically, this connects to something the existentialists grasped with uncomfortable clarity. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the tendency to escape the anxiety of genuine selfhood by performing a fixed identity rather than living with the uncertainty of who you actually are. Narcissistic armor is, in a sense, the ultimate act of bad faith, a self constructed entirely for an audience because the self underneath felt too exposed, too uncertain, too vulnerable to survive contact with the world without protection. The performance is not an expression of the self, it is a replacement for one. And here is what that means practically. The narcissistic person is not trapped in their behavior because they love themselves too much. They are trapped because they cannot access enough of themselves to feel secure without constant external proof that they matter. So what can you do with this? If you recognize these patterns in someone close to you, understanding the behavior as a coping mechanism does not mean tolerating harm. It means recognizing that the defense has a function and that confronting it without addressing what it is protecting rarely produces lasting change. Therapeutic approaches drawing on Kohut's self-psychology tend to focus on building the inner stability the person never developed, rather than simply dismantling the performance. And if you recognize something of this in yourself, a hunger for validation that never quite gets satisfied, a sensitivity to criticism that feels disproportionate, a sense that your worth depends entirely on how others see you, that recognition is not a verdict. Psychologist Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion suggests the antidote to this wound is not harder self-improvement, but the slow and genuinely difficult practice of learning to feel worth something from the inside. A small but real starting point. Notice when you are performing versus when you are simply present. The distance between those two states is the territory worth exploring. The grandiosity was never really about greatness. It was about survival. The question is not whether you have ever met someone convinced the world revolved around them. The question is whether they were ever given a world that made them feel safe enough to stop pretending it did.